Hello everybody, and welcome back to another exciting episode of Clown World. On today's exciting episode, me, your host, Benjamin Towels, yeah, that's who I am. We're going to talk about something that I think has so much ripeness for some deep diving, for some rabbit holes, and that's the World's Fair. You've probably heard of it, but you probably don't really know much about it. So let's look into it. Let's look what's going on with the World's Fair. What's so weird about it? Why would you even bring it up on an episode of Clown World? Sounds pretty straightforward. Let's look. It's never straightforward. It's always a... The World's Fair is a large international exhibition designed to showcase achievements of nations. These exhibitions vary in character and are held in different parts of the world at a specific site for a period of time ranging usually from 3 to 6 months. The term World's Fair is typically used in the United States. In France, however, the term Exposition Universelle, the Universal Exposition, is used instead. So to understand what we're talking about, we've of course got to go back and understand the official version. So let's look at the official version. The tradition started in France with national exhibitions, a tradition that culminated with the French Industrial Exposition of 1844 held in Paris. This fair is followed by other national exhibitions in continental Europe and the United Kingdom. The best known first World Expo was held in the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, London, United Kingdom in the 1850s, under the title Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. The Great Exhibition, as it is often called, was an idea of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband. It is usually considered to be the first international exhibition of manufactured products. It influenced the development of several aspects of society, including art and design education, international trade and relations, and tourism. This expo was the precedent for many international exhibitions, later called World Expos, that have continued to be held to the present time. It was basically a giant Comic-Con or anime convention, but instead of it being about anime, it was about products of the time, like the cotton gin, or like wheels, light bulbs, ice boxes. What else came out back then? What, TVs? Sliced bread? You know? So when it comes to types of World Expos, we can actually break up the history of World Expos, World Fairs, into 3 parts. So the 3 main types, the 3 main eras of World Expositions were the Industrialization era, which is like the 1850s to the 1940s, where they're just showing off new technology, new advancements, the light bulb, the telephone, stuff like that. And then it shifted. In the next era, it became about cultural exchange, sharing our ideas of how we live life and your ideas. And then in the 80s, it became the third wave, which was just nation branding, which was just everybody trying to virtue signal and increase their nation's standing on the world stage by having pavilions, and it kind of lost its edge. But in today's episode, we're really only going to be focusing on the industrialization, the first era of these world fairs, because that's where a lot of these curiosities come up. That's where they exist. So we're going to check out the eras of like the 1850s to the 1930s, right around there. And in particular, from that era, the first fair that I want to focus on is one that was held in Chicago in 1893, and it's called the World's Columbian Exposition. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, let me just show you what it looks like. We'll just look at it first, and then you could try to piece together why I'm even talking about it. Let's just look at it. And then I'm going to start sprinkling in some facts, like how long this officially took to build. How long did they officially keep it up? And what did they do with it after it was officially over? I'm like running out of like finger quotes. Officially. My entire show could have just been called finger quotes. So it was held in 1893 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus and his arrival in the New World in 1492. The centerpiece of the fair, held in Jackson Park, was a large water pool representing the voyage Columbus took to the New World. Chicago had won the right to host the fair over several other cities, including New York City, Washington, D.C., and St. Louis. The exposition was an influential social and cultural event and had a profound effect on architecture, sanitation, the arts, Chicago's self-image, and American industrial optimism. Aw, gee goody, I bet it did. The layout of the Chicago Columbian Exposition was, in large part, designed by John Wellborn Root, Daniel Burnham, Frederick Law Olmsted, and Charles B. Atwood. It was the prototype of what Burnham and his colleagues thought a city should be. So they created the ideal city, and it looks like this. So much like Epcot from modern day Disney World was trying to be like a city of the future, the World's Fair of Chicago in the 1800s is supposed to be a recreation of what an idealistic city would look like. And something that differs from a lot of our modern day cities is that this city is absolutely gorgeous. Alright, so here's my main issue. Here's my main question about this. Did you guys build all this stuff just for a fair? You built all of this, just for a fair. The exposition covered over 690 acres, 2.8 kilometers, featuring nearly 200 new but deliberately temporary, in quotes again, deliberately temporary, buildings of predominantly neoclassical architecture, canals and lagoons, and people and cultures from 46 different countries. More than 27 million people attended the exposition during its 6-month run. Its scale and grandeur far exceeded the other World's Fair, and it became a symbol of the emerging American exceptionalism. That's a real term. You can go to Wikipedia, and American exceptionalism is a hyperlink. Yeehaw! We're really optimistic. America loves itself. You should too. Dedication ceremonies for the fair were held on October 21st, 1892. So the Chicago people had to bid for the World Fair to be held there instead of New York and St. Louis. And so they ended up bidding about $20 million, which I did the calculations, and that's times that by 20, and that's basically what inflation is. So I'm horrible at math. What is 20 by 20? $400 million? So $400 million in today's money built all of this. Now remember, this is just parts of the World's Fair. The actual thing is massive, and it's so many more buildings than this. But just these buildings alone, look at their size and intricacy. Also, curiously enough, there were some old-timey celebrities involved in this. There actually was a painting exhibit done by George Washington Carver, the dude who invented peanut butter. There was also Aunt Jemima has a character at this World Fair, Aunt Jemima. Apparently everybody knew Aunt Jemima back then. And then totally not suspicious at all, but the fair actually ended because the mayor of Chicago was assassinated. So that's probably not involved in any of this curiosity. That's probably a separate matter. Probably not though. It's probably connected. Yeah, but Carter Harrison Sr., he was assassinated by Patrick Eugene Prendergast. And they don't make last names like they used to. Another somewhat famous person from back then who was at the fair was actually George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. And you might know him from creating his famous Ferris Wheel. And here is the Ferris Wheel they built for the Chicago World's Fair. Now here's a normal size Ferris wheel for comparison. Look at the scale of this Ferris wheel. Look at how massive this is. This is absolutely breathtaking. Buffalo Bill wasn't allowed to go to the fair and set up. So instead he set up outside of the fair, just a few feet outside the fair. Buffalo Bill set up his own exhibition. Everybody wanted to be at this fair. It was the who's who. And of the commercial products that were presented at this fair, the couple that come to mind are Juicy Fruit Gum and PBR, Pabst Blue Ribbon. Yeah, I had no idea that this stuff was this old. I wonder if there was like a beer contest and Pabst got the blue ribbon at the world. Probably not. I don't know how it works. Over 46 different countries all had exhibitions at this fair, including a Norway exposition where they sent a Viking ship. Like they literally built a Viking ship in Norway and then sailed it across the Atlantic. But how did they get to Chicago? This isn't adding. This is what? There's no inland.
So as it turns out, I actually learned today that there is a water route from Norway to Chicago, believe it or not.
But also there's a lot of different states. Over 34 U.S. states had their own pavilions. Even some U.S. territories that weren't states at the time, like Arizona, also had pavilions set up.
While not nearly as massive as some of the main buildings, the sheer number of all of these state buildings and country buildings is very, very impressive.
And that brings us to the first real rabbit hole involved in all of this. It says officially that all these buildings, all this crazy architecture, was not made of stone, was actually made of a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber called staff, that it was like stucco, and it was painted white. So essentially, all these buildings, sculptures, and statues are just stucco. They're just plaster. They're not actually made out of anything. They're made to look like they're made out of something. And that's official. That's the official version. So I'm like thinking that, I'm hearing this, and I'm like, okay. Dang, I don't know, man. That's a pretty big building. That's a lot of plaster. Plaster even was like, could you even hold its weight? I don't know enough about architecture, but I know that these buildings are crazy intricate. These are huge. Look at this one. This is made out of stucco. This statue is made out of plaster. What? And officially, this whole thing started construction at the latest, like 1891, 1892. So they built all of this in the span of less than a year?
When you look at the sheer scope of it all, the only word that comes to mind is unbelievable.
What? Is that even doable? Is that possible? Now here, we got to consider, all right, let's grain of salt it. Let's look at the silver lining and potential of just like, well, maybe it did happen the way they said it. So perhaps in the past, humans were really good at shit. We were really capable, and we are really motivated and focused, and that our organization was great, so that if we got enough people together, we could just really do some crazy, amazing things together. And then suddenly we just lost that ability, or I don't know. I just really doubt that in 1 year, in today's time, we could build this. We probably couldn't even build one of these buildings in 1 year, let alone this entire complex, with only $400 million. And that's the crux of today's episode. So let's look more. Let's dive in deeper, because this doesn't make sense.
So one of the reasons why I really love this topic is because it's just so deep. There's so much for you to look at and explore. Just the sheer size of the fair and the complex itself, with all the numbers of different buildings and exhibits, and just the number of different World's Fairs in general that exist. Anytime you go back before there's video cameras, you are time traveling to a different world. The average person back then was so dramatically different than the average person today. It's utterly unbelievable.
So then the fair ends, and they tear everything down. Curiously, two structures, major structures, were not torn down and still exist today. They are the Museum of Science and Industry and the Palace of Fine Arts. And if you look at pictures of them, you can see why they weren't torn down, because these are massive, nearly megalithic structures. These are literal palaces of fine arts. And weren't these supposed to be built out of plaster and stucco? So how did they survive standing up this long? Did they remodel them with actual, materials? Or perhaps did they build some of these seriously? So we spent time in the span of 1 year to build these two permanent structures and a bunch of temporary structures. It's all just so weird. It's all just so odd to me. Like, why did they pick and choose what they made out of plaster? They had time constraints. What can you really get away with making out of plaster? Officially, the people loved these buildings so much that they all said, hey, we should remake these buildings and put marble on the outside instead of plaster. But in 1894, they couldn't do that anymore because a fire destroyed most of the fairgrounds.
So officially speaking, there's nothing suspicious about the fact that the mayor of Chicago was assassinated and then the entire fairgrounds burned down. That isn't even remotely suspicious. Officially speaking, of course.
Yeah, that just happens. That happened a lot back then. Fires, entire cities of megalithic structures gone. Now, of course, take it with a grain of salt. I'm just offering my contestation of the idea that all of these buildings got destroyed in an accidental fire. That's my contestation. This happened very recently. Maybe check it out. I mean, a thing to consider about like cover-ups and conspiracies and rabbit holes is like the further back you go, the less the common people had knowledge of those types of things. So it was way easier back then to get away with cover-ups. You could sell people bridges back then, you know what I'm saying? But at the time, people were not open to the ideas that they might be doing that. Nowadays, we know. So back then, they could have just destroyed, knocked it all down, and just put in the paper, fire happened. And everybody'd be like, okay, yeah, fire happened.
Just consider nowadays how much you trust newspapers or the media. Now consider back then.
We don't have Twitter. You can't do like hashtag World's Fair fire. Oh man, they're burning it down right now. Deleted from Twitter.
Uh-oh.
So anything that goes on back then, before your lifetime, before recorded history, that's where the rabbit holes could get funny. And many famous people of that time actually attended the fair, even if they didn't have an exhibition set up. One famous person who attended the fair was Helen Keller, who actually, wrote about her experience. She described the fair in her autobiography, The Story of My Life, which I'm sure is riveting with detail. There's also a famous story involving the War of the Currents between Edison and Tesla, where Westinghouse and Tesla got a bid to produce the electricity for the entire World's Fair, but they were sued by a copyright patent by Edison. So to actually provide the light bulbs and whatnot, Tesla just invented neon lighting right there and then on the spot because he couldn't use his previous design that was owned by Edison. Here's the other list of notable firsts that came from the World's Fair. We got the brownie was invented by Bertha Palmer. Thank you. Milton Hershey bought a European chocolate manufacturing equipment, and added chocolate products to his caramel manufacturing business. That's the Hershey bar. If you're familiar at all with the mud flood theories from the first episode of Clown World, then these buildings and architecture might look familiar to you, because this is Tartarian architecture to a T. Notice again the intricacies, the scopeness, the ornateness of all these buildings. That sort of Greek classical style that we see everywhere, all over any major political capital.
We are led to believe that these buildings amount to little more than a Hollywood movie set.
All these buildings in such a weird spot. All these statues, everything you see, apparently made out of plaster, not real.
And when you look at these old buildings, really be sure to check out where the people are, because that'll give you a nice scale of just the sheer size of these structures. Here's an elephant for better scaling.
Those are like multi-storied buildings that are standing up somehow, made entirely out of plaster. So what might actually be going on? Well, it's possible that this entire city was already here, already built. Then maybe they dug it out like a mud flood building, a mud flood city, and then people came in, they held a fair, and then afterwards they tore it all down and destroyed it to cover up the alternative history about what civilization used to be in North America. So it seems like these fairs were some sort of deliberate attempt to go explain away why all these fantastic buildings and architecture existed in North America and all over the world.
Some angles of this theory could even provide that at one point in the past, there was a multinational sort of community that already existed on the world stage, and they'd already come together several times to have like little hub cities here and there where everybody has representation. And then sadly, just gone, forgotten, destroyed, overwritten. We are constantly being told what our past is or was from authorities who are constantly showing us that they can't be trusted. So were these buildings really made out of stucco and plaster? Was this all just a giant facade? Or was there something a little deeper going on in North America before the invention of the photograph? All I know for sure is the world is not what it seems.
And that'll wrap up today's episode. I hope you had fun looking into this. You can check out any World's Fair from that era, and you'll find some crazy stuff and some amazing looking buildings. Be sure to take everything you hear with a grain of salt. Be a good person. Stay vigilant. I'm Benjamin Towles. This is Clown World. Call your mom. Peace.